Hello, everybody. Welcome to Talking Stuff on the podcast. I am Jeremy Birmingham. I'll be joined momentarily by my co host and cohort, Andrew Ellis. We're going to talk about all of the latest things going on in Ohio State football recruiting, including some changes that have been made in the class of 2025 and some changes that may be coming to the class of 2025. It is going to be a hectic run to the early signing period, which is December 4th through the 6th. And there's a lot of moving parts for Ohio State and for pretty much everyone in college football. So let's get to the show. Andrew Ellis joins me now on Talking Stuff. Andrew, we're not going to talk about the Bengals because it's not, I just can't relitigate all the pain they're causing in our lives. So let's talk about happy things like decommitments from Ohio State, because that's where we're going to start this show is Zahir Mathis, the four-star defensive end from Ematep Charter in Philadelphia, officially announced his reopening of his recruitment on Monday. We have kind of had him as one of the guys circled since the summer, and that started when he made an official visit to Penn State. There's been a lot of discussion about Penn State since then. And I think when he made the announcement on Monday, the initial belief was like, oh, Penn State must have come through with the financial request that he was asking from either school in order to be the place for him. That's really been the holdup for Ohio State. They have a value that they assign to these players. And if these guys want more than that, almost certainly they're going to have to go somewhere else because the Buckeyes are extremely, I don't want to say stubborn, because I think that's indicating that I disagree with their stance. And I don't. I do think that they are very resolute in the way that they handle this because they don't want it to get away from them. But with Zahir Mathis now off the commitment list, Ohio State back to 25 commitments in the class of 2025. Zahir had been committed for 10 months. He committed in early January. And now here they sit with no Zahir Mathis in the class. And the guy that I think is the most true of the edge rushers that was in the class for Ohio State is now not in the class. How are you feeling about it as we sit here recording this on a Tuesday night?
Well, I think you've kind of prepared myself and the masses that this could be inevitable. But then when he did finally make it back to Columbus, I kind of thought maybe things were back on track. Obviously, they were not. I really like those 6'6" types that are about. I think he's listed at 220, and I think you were told it's probably significantly less than that. Am I correct?
Last I heard, it was 216.
Oh.
I've seen that has vacillated a little bit between like 205 to 215 to 218. From what I understand, when he came to Ohio State at the end of October for his official visit, it was 216.
Yeah, and I don't want to call him he's a project, as in he's not going to probably contribute right away. But Ohio State just has a knack for bringing in those 6'3" to 6'5" guys that weigh like 240 to 260, and we're always wondering, are they going to play tackle at the next level, or are they going to play edge? I mean, we saw it this go around. Edric Houston's already moved to the inside. I liked that Mathis was one of those more, no doubt about it, this guy's going to be an edge rusher type. And they don't bring in a lot of those guys. I wish they would bring in more of those guys, I guess. But I do find it interesting. Go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, I'm just saying it'd be nice if more of those guys existed.
I know those guys are kind of hard to find, but I do find it interesting that when he committed to Ohio State back in the day, the schools we were talking about were like Georgia, Alabama, maybe even Penn State to a lesser degree. But now it's like we're talking about maybe Penn State and then schools like Syracuse and Colorado. So that kind of gets the wheels spinning as far as like what's happened over the last year with him, how much is NIL involved. We know it's always a factor, but I don't love that this went from being a really on paper impressive edge class with probably three guys to now you having two guys, and one of them, London Merritt, we'll talk about later, maybe a tackle. I don't know. So kind of expected. This isn't like I'm not dying on the inside because of this, but I'm a little bit upset about it.
Yeah, to me, it's just another example of like when we're entering this era of college football that it is hard to make sense of the idea that you pay someone hundreds of thousands of dollars who is from another state, who may not last at Ohio State longer than a year or two anyway, and then you realize that you're paying them all this money and they're not going to play. The bottom line is Ohio State is not going to do it, and that is, and I don't mean to, I'm not. I know that the public um, discourse about commitments will always be like, oh, that's just it's sour grapes, it's whatever. The bottom line in this recruitment for the last handful of months has been one of these schools around the country is going to pay what the Mathis camp has been asking for, and that's where he's going to end up going to school. And Ohio State was just not going to be that camp. And so now, then it becomes a different conversation, right? Then it becomes a matter of, well, is the evaluation wrong? Because if Zahir Mathis ends up being a superstar down the road, and I've heard other schools like Florida State, Florida being involved, and the schools that are going to be sort of desperate right now to make a splash because now they're going to be able to turn around and say, oh, we snagged this former Ohio State commit, blah, blah, blah. Those schools are going to play a little more fast and loose with the pocketbook. Ohio State is absolutely unequivocally changing its philosophy when it comes to this sort of thing, because there are going to be players every year. There's the Devin Sanchez's of the world, the Jeremiah Smiths of the world, that you're going to be like, look, whatever this kid wants, we're going to make sure he gets. And that's fine. But that's going to be a very small group of kids every year. And it is beyond that, past that 10 or 15 guys. I think you're going to see a lot of players who are somewhat interchangeable. And for a guy like Zahir Mathis, the battle or the argument comes down to, does recruiting a 6'6", 205-pound, 210-pound defensive end, who, if you look at the national recruiting rankings through the different networks, there's some mixed opinions about his upside and what he is as a player. And I think that's important to note because, again, when you're talking about the players that, like, there are no questions, these conversations are not the same. But for Ohio State, does it not make more sense to find a guy who's played 2 years of college football, who has 2 years left, that can play for the next 2 years at defensive end instead of sitting on the bench for 2 years? Like, these are the things you have to ask yourself. And it's the other side of this is that at Ohio State, you also have Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry and Joshua Mickens. And now the idea, Jim Knowles was talking on Tuesday about how they really think now the future for CJ Hicks will be at the edge. Like, now you start to have these other pieces that you're like, well, maybe you don't need another project. Maybe you need a guy that's a finished model that's going to come in. If you have to choose, and I'm just going to pick a random name out here. This is not me hinting anything, I promise. Like the dude at Marshall, right? Like that Mike Green guy. I think that's his name. He's like dominating in Conference USA. If you have to choose between the player of the year in Conference USA or the Sun Belt or the MAC, or a high school kid who's going to need at least a year, maybe two, to develop, and by the time he gets done with that, may not have wanted to wait around at Ohio State anyway because he was coming into the program thinking he was going to be the king of the world, and then he's gone anyway. Like, I don't know. This is similar to a conversation we had the last time we did Talking Stuff, but I think that we have to start looking at it from a totally different perspective. And for the long time, like, recruiting fans, the lovers of the inside baseball side of recruiting, I think it's going to feel crappy at times. But I don't know that you can really fault the kid, or in this case, Zahir Mathis, for what he's trying to do. But I don't think you can blame Ohio State for saying, well, sorry, dude, we're not going to go that route. Now, if you want to say there needs to be a backup plan because this feels inevitable for a lot of these kids, then I think that's a whole different conversation. And I think it's fair. I think that's one area where Larry Johnson's style and the way he recruits, and he is so relationship focused, and he dials in on 5 or 6 guys, and that's it. There is no one else that he's been talking to. There is no chance to pivot late and add someone else because Larry Johnson is not going to even consider bringing in a player he hasn't personally vetted for like a long time. So I think that's a different argument. But anyone who's actually upset or thinks Ohio State is doing the wrong thing here, or that Zahir Mathis is doing the wrong thing here, I don't know that that's true either way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you mentioned one example, the kid from Marshall, a not heralded recruit who is now putting up absurd numbers at a school like Marshall. And I think the other way you can also look at it is look at a guy who was a heralded recruit, perhaps a guy Ohio State did have a relationship with, who has not really put it together yet in college. And you mentioned a name just kind of out of the blue with no reasoning behind it, so I'll also go ahead and do that. Like Keon Keeley, obviously was a huge Ohio State target a couple years back. It was Notre Dame, it was Alabama, it was Ohio State. I mean, he's in Tuscaloosa now. Obviously, there's a new coach there. He's
Hasn't played.
last night, yeah, hasn't played at all. I think I saw something once that he didn't even like dress for a game or two. And I mean, maybe that's one that circles back around to Ohio State. And I know if that happens, there's going to be that segment of the fan base that says, well, why do you want this kid who hasn't done anything? And my answer to that would be, obviously, he's got like the pedigree, at least from the recruiting side. He's at freaking Alabama, so he's playing behind studs. And it's a completely different defensive scheme than maybe he doesn't want to be that Will Anderson. Maybe he wants to be Chase Young, and maybe he can or maybe he can't be. But that's just, I don't know. There's multiple ways.
But he
to look
also
at
has
this.
2 years in a high level weight program.
Exactly.
You don't have to build him up. You have to maybe teach him some new things. But Keon Keeley is a prime example to me of, like, if everyone who was involved in the Keon Keeley recruitment, except for Keon Keeley, knew that his future was going to be as a 4-3 defensive end, and he chose to believe what Alabama was selling. Or and now the question of why he chose to believe that, I don't know. Obviously, outside influences being what they are, and family dynamics and stuff like that led to a lot of decisions. But we've seen that for a lot of kids, and I do feel bad in a way for Zahir Mathis, because I don't think he made this decision on Monday with a clear plan in place for his future, and that is risky. That is super risky. Now he's a 4-star recruit. He's a top 100 recruit on Rivals.com. Like, he's not going to have any problem finding a location to fall and land, but the odds of him finding a better situation than Ohio State for his long-term development on and off the field are very low. But when the decision that's being made isn't entirely based on what is good for you in the long term, but what's good for you in the short term, like, these are the sort of myopic things that happen. And it's going to be interesting. I don't know. When Zahir Mathis originally committed to Ohio State, I know I told some people that I'm close with and talk about recruiting stuff that I would be shocked if he signed with Ohio State. And at the time, I said I believe a program like Syracuse was one I was looking at as maybe a potential landing spot. They're close to home. Elijah Robinson, the defensive line coach at Syracuse from Texas A&M, is a Philly guy. Like, they have a lot of ties. So I'm still looking at that, but it'll be interesting. I saw EJ Holland from the Michigan on 3 site tweeting after Zahir made his announcement that he really liked him and hoped Michigan would go after him. Like, we'll see. I don't know. Michigan's hosting the wide receiver who was committed to Ohio State early in the process.
Javon Boggs.
Javon Boggs. They're hosting him this weekend for an official visit. Maybe they'll just get everyone that Ohio State didn't want to pay. But it's certainly going to be interesting for Zahir.
One last thing I'll say on that is, you know how when a kid decommits from a school and you have fans of that school or recruiting experts such as yourself mentioning NIL or mentioning a mutual parting of ways, you usually have fans from the rival school saying, well, those Ohio State fans, they're just butthurt that this kid doesn't want to play there. On this time, I actually saw some talk on the Penn State sites from one of their insiders saying that, yes, Ohio State is not willing to meet whatever demands, but from what he was suggesting, it doesn't sound like Penn State is either. So
yeah,
who knows?
Which is, again, that's the crux of this whole issue. Like, if you're a recruit, and I don't generally speak to the recruits out there on these shows, but if the people in your circle are telling you to bluff, you better be prepared to be called on that bluff. And I think that's probably what happened in this instance. Zahir, from my understanding, was not planning on signing anywhere until February. So there was always going to be a plan in place here for this to last a few more months. So it's not like he's going to run out of time or anything, but it does make things interesting for the next few weeks. And, as far as Ohio State goes, I've seen speculation online that, well, this is because Jakeem Stewart is coming to Ohio State and they didn't need Zahir Mathis. And I'm not going to completely drench the idea that Jakeem Stewart could end up at Ohio State. But if you're going into this next 10 days before his official visit starts at Ohio State the weekend of the Michigan game, thinking Ohio State is anything better than third in that race, I would tell you to probably slow down a little bit. The Buckeyes are involved. They are still confident that they can win that battle. But as we talked about a lot on the last show of Talking Stuff, there's no reasonable expectation for Jakeem Stewart to come in and be a star as a freshman or start as a freshman. Now, he has that expectation for himself, and I appreciate that about him. He's extremely confident. I hope he proves me wrong if he's at Ohio State, but there is no doubt that Oregon and LSU are both in a much different mindset when it comes to what they're going to be willing to offer up. And the number that I've heard for Jakeem Stewart is roughly 6 times what Zahir Mathis wants. So it's not exactly something where I think Ohio State would be like, you know what, that's great, we got it. Like I don't know that would happen. So if your belief is that Zahir Mathis is moving on to make room for Jakeem Stewart, I would ask you to pump your brakes just a little bit. And it has nothing to do with Justin Hill. There is no conversation going on with Ohio State and Justin Hill. That is not happening either. This is simply a matter of a young man and the people around him deciding they needed to try and capitalize on his name, image, and likeness. And we'll see if it works out for him. It's highly unlikely it will work out for him at Ohio State, despite the fact that he said the Buckeyes are still one of his top schools moving forward. I don't think that will work out for those two sides. Now, moving on from Zahir Mathis, but staying on the same topic of like what is happening for Ohio State recruiting in the next 2 weeks, because we are now 15 days as we record this from the start of the early signing period. Mathis is one of those players we had circled on the, well, that could be interesting board. And there are a handful of others, and it's very likely there's going to be more tosses and turns in these next few weeks. We can see that the majority of them are on defense, and that is a concern for a program that is trying to replace a lot of defensive stars. You would think that the opportunity to come in and develop and play early, because Ryan Day and Jim Knowles seem intent on playing guys earlier than ever before, would open some doors. But again, similar to Mathis, there are going to be decisions that are made solely on NIL. And the first one of those that I think it would probably be London Merritt, as you mentioned, the one to talk about. He's from the IMG Academy, 6'3", 240-pound defensive end. It looks like he's going to make a final decision between Ohio State and Colorado on December 6th, the final day of the signing period. There's been a lot of talk about Colorado. He visited there last week. He took an official visit there in October. This one's going to come down to very simple. Like, Ohio State is not going to pay him what Colorado will pay him, period. So if he wants to make that amount of money and he trusts what Deion Sanders is doing, then I think he's probably going to end up at Colorado. As Ohio State, their message has been very simple. This is how we see you. This is how you're going to make money. This is how you're going to be developed. This is what it is at Ohio State. We're not changing it for anyone. And so that decision is going to have to be made for London Merritt and his family. Again, like, it feels kind of crappy. Like, it doesn't feel like this is what NIL was ever intended to be, but we were pretty aware when it started that losing control of it quickly felt like a pretty much an inevitability.
With that one, it's just weird to me because it seems like ever since he's committed, even though he's taken other visits, I know he visited North Carolina and some other schools, it never really seemed like anything was in jeopardy. And now all of a sudden, with Colorado there and him visiting Boulder, it seems like it's gone from like threat level yellow up to threat level orange, maybe.
Yeah.
But I mean, is Deion Sanders even going to be there next year? Who knows? They're having a good season. Might very well end up in the playoff. But I mean, I don't know who plays defense at Colorado besides Travis Hunter.
No, I mean, they lead the country in sacks. I mean, Warren Sapp is helping with their defensive line. So, like,
did not know that.
Yeah, they're putting a really like pressure-filled defense on the field, and that's probably enticing. But regardless, the decision is not coming down to that. It is coming down to, I think I can still succeed there and make more money than I would make at Ohio State. And so that's ultimately what the discussion and the decision is going to come down to. Now, the the facts are London Merritt will be at Ohio State for the Michigan game. So they're going to have an opportunity to sit down with him and his family and break things down and say, hey, this is where we are. This is why you committed to Ohio State. This is why you love Larry Johnson. This is why we are the right fit for you. This is a kid who, as you said, like there was never any sign of real wavering in this recruitment. And now here we sit with 2 weeks before the signing period, and it feels like maybe it's trending the wrong way. Defensive lineman Jarquez Carter, defensive tackle, he's another guy that has been talked about a lot in the last few months since he committed, multiple visits to Florida, Miami. The battle is going to be real there. Ohio State loves Jarquez Carter. They want him in this class pretty bad. I don't know that the same rigidity inside of the NIL structure is applicable to Jarquez as it is to London Merritt or Zahir Mathis. Same with TJ Alford. Like the Ohio State loves TJ Alford. Miami, Florida State are both getting pretty desperate in this time to keep him in Florida. Conversation seems pretty much centered on Ohio State and their reluctance to bend on their evaluation and their valuation, and family matters and family ties. And this isn't a secret. I mean, we've talked about TJ Alford since he committed, and there was no doubt that family people wanted him to stay closer to home. Now the question is Ohio State in a position to do things to manage that, like making sure that family members can get to all the games and all that stuff? Like there's tons of rumors flying around, some rumors about a house, some rumors about just wanting travel to games. Like you never know what's real because everything in the NIL space is completely like done in the shadows, but we've seen it before. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising. Ohio State is fighting hard to make sure that TJ Alford does not leave this class. That's what I know.
Does what you said, valuation and evaluation? Obviously, we're talking NIL with some of that, but I had seen some comments from him about, I can't remember if it's like the way Ohio State uses its linebackers compared to how he could be used at one of the Florida schools. Have you heard any scuttlebutt about that at all? I didn't know what that meant.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I've read it. I've seen where he talked about how he thinks that maybe the linebackers at Miami or Florida State play more free. They're less constricted by the defensive scheme. They're more able to just use their athleticism and run around. From an Ohio State perspective, that's not a good thing. Like their belief is like, yeah, but we can teach you how to actually play linebacker for the NFL. I'm going to say this, and I'm not dismissing the thought that maybe you get to do more athletic stuff in Miami's defense or Florida State's. Florida State's 1-9. So I mean, if you want to go into that, I don't. Every one of those conversations, every possible explanation / excuse / justification for considering a flip from the school that you've been committed to in TJ Alford's case since March, but he really was like privately committed for like 6 months before that. Every justification is simply a way to say, I'm going to get more money somewhere else. Like that's what it comes down to. Like it doesn't, if Ohio State was offering the same amount of money as Miami or Florida State, it would not be a discussion. That's the reality. So once you get beyond that part, sure, you're going to come up with other justifications. But again, James Laurinaitis is working his tail off to try to keep that relationship going strong. There is still very good communication between Alford and Laurinaitis and Alford's mother. Like there's still a lot of that conversation happening, but you're going to be in a position heading into the last 2 weeks where these numbers that are being thrown at these kids are crazy. And that's the bottom line. There's all those kids on defense dealing with it, and then there's Quincy Porter on offense dealing with it. And Ohio State is obviously, I think, differently positioned when it comes to a wide receiver because Brian Hartline's track record and the proof of life there is so much different than it is at any other position. But from what I understand, there are teams offering almost a full 2 times what Ohio State is presenting in the NIL package for Quincy Porter. But what matters? What matters the most to you? Quincy Porter is not going to be offered anything more at Ohio State than Carnell Tate was or Brandon Innes was. And he's going to have to decide if that's enough, or if you just take the short-term gain and go play somewhere where they don't develop wide receivers. And these are the discussions people have to have. It sucks. It's really unfortunate. There has to be guardrails put in place soon, or every year it's just going to be this way.
Yeah, I Quincy Porter is another one that's just kind of surprising to me. I thought it was Ohio State or Michigan when he committed, and now he suddenly shows up at Penn State. And I don't know how real the Penn State talk is. We can get to that more in a second. But like, we watched the Ohio State Penn State game. How many times have you heard Julian Fleming's name all season? Like, I looked at his game log earlier this week, and there are multiple games where he had like 4 yards. He didn't have a catch last week. And again, if you're Penn State, you're saying, well, this could, you could come in right away and all this. And I understand how that could be appealing as well. But I don't know. I just have a hard time believing that's one they could lose. But do you get the sense that there's any panic with that?
Well, there's never any panic, because Brian Hartline doesn't panic, because he knows that next year he's in line to have Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate and Brandon Innes and Bryson Rogers and and Mylan Graham. He's not going to panic. But we are in such a different time that, I don't want to, I'm not going to put a percentage on things or a 1 to 10 number, but when one school, and let's just say it's Penn State as a hypothetical, is a pretty good team, wins 10, 11 games a year. Sure, they never win anything important, but and their wide receiver play is very subpar. Yeah, you're going to be able to go in there and play early. It's not far from home, all the other things. If that place is offering you 2x what Ohio State is, it's hard to turn that down. Now, again, it requires these players and their families having the ability to think beyond their nose and see, like, well, if we take, I mean, it's just so funny to me. And this is not a knock on any specific player, but just this absurdity of where we're at in college football. If you were to mention to me 2 years ago that a player decided, like, and this is a hypothetical number, I don't know the numbers that are actually being discussed for each player. If a wide receiver said, you know what, I'm not going to go to Ohio State because they're only going to give me $200,000, you'd be like, what? But that's where we are now. We're in the insanity zone. And I don't know how to stop it.
And Florida is also involved, or Florida is trying with him as well, correct?
Yeah. I mean, and when he committed to Ohio State, there was a lot of talk about Michigan, but Alabama was one of the ones that was really involved. And so, like, I guess I wouldn't put anything past anyone. But I don't know. I mean, we are in a very peculiar time. Like, how do you look at this and say, well, this is exactly the way this is supposed to be. This is good. This is the way we want it. Whatever. Bottom line, there's 2 weeks until the early signing period, and there are going to be some interesting machinations happening. Ohio State, with 25 commitments, currently has the number 1 ranked class in the country. I think it will be hard for them to finish that way, just because if you lose 1 or 2 of these guys we just talked about, the likelihood of those guys ending up at Georgia or Oregon, or like, those are the schools you have to worry about moving forward. But it's weird, and I know it doesn't feel good, but I know from talking to people around the program, like, there's no panic at Ohio State. They're like, if we lose guys that are in high school, we will replace them with better players, and that's always their perspective and always their approach. And you just have to trust that it's happening. I mean, there has not been a time yet when Ohio State hasn't done that in the transfer portal. So I don't think they want to do that all the time, but we are now entering a much different conversation. Turbo Rogers decommitted from Alabama on Sunday. The 5'9", 180 pounds, scat back / slot back / player. Ohio State and Georgia are the two at the top of the list for him. There is an expectation that he will decide in the signing period in 2 weeks. I would be shocked if anything happened before then. Certainly seems like a lot of momentum for Ohio State after his official visit for the Purdue game. Andrew, we talked a lot about Turbo and why that visit happened and why maybe Ohio State changed their stance on him in the class. And it seems like they're pot committed to making sure he's in the class from here. I do know that he is a take at Georgia. The Bulldogs want him. He took an official visit to Athens in October. It will be interesting to me to see if he returns to either one of those places this weekend or next. Each of those schools, Ohio State and Georgia, both have 2 games left. Both have 2 games at home, so there's an opportunity to split the baby. We'll see what he does, though.
Yeah, no, I'm in favor of this one. I think 3 backs was always kind of the dream scenario. With him being more of a hybrid, maybe you call it 2.5 backs. I don't love that Georgia would take him just because I know we've talked about proximity from home maybe being a factor here. But obviously, hometown ties to Carlos Lachlan. I like that. So, I hope they get this done. I'm totally in favor of this. So I'm hoping it happens, and I'm hoping he doesn't show up in Athens in the next couple weeks. I don't know what Georgia's schedule is like, so I don't even know who they're playing or if they're home. They've probably got like Mercer or one of those SEC games coming up to where they play nobody, but I don't know.
Yeah, they play. It's UMass this weekend, and then Georgia Tech. So we'll see. Speaking of Georgia Tech, Damola Ajidahun, the offensive lineman, still committed to Georgia Tech. He will visit the Yellow Jackets again this week. He has returned to South Carolina since his Ohio State official visit. From what I understand, and this is not going to make people happy, but it's also going to make people go, "See, I told you." I don't feel good about Ohio State getting the flip happening there at this point. From what I've gathered, what I'm gleaning, there has not been a ton of responsiveness as Ohio State continues to try and talk to him. We'll see. He's kind of like a lot of the big offensive linemen from the South, like they are interested in being kind of homebodies. They're not exactly the most outgoing kids when it comes to having conversation. And there are other things about Damola and his situation that I'm not going to talk about right now that I think it's going to be a challenge for any school to try to get him in at some point. But certainly the Buckeyes are very interested in him, and they're continuing to try and have conversation. But I guess it's been a little bit hit or miss, hot and cold when it comes to the response. So at this point, I'm not going to say that I'm optimistic he'll be back for the Michigan game, but I know the Buckeyes are still trying. Other than that, though, Andrew, like I don't know that there's anybody else on the Ohio State big board that's worth really looking at other than Jordan Woods at cornerback, who will visit this weekend. And we'll talk a little bit more about him when we break down some of the visitors this weekend. And then there is still a list of 2 or 3 other cornerbacks, guys that I'm not going to mention, as I've said before, until they give me the green light or until they schedule a visit to Ohio State. But there are still players committed elsewhere at corner that they're looking at. And that, I guess, is the only other position where I think you would see some movement. I do not expect Malik Autry to come visit Ohio State for the Michigan game. I know that's been discussed a lot elsewhere. Just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So if it does happen, I'll be surprised. I'd love to be wrong because I think he'd be like a perfect fit for Ohio State at the One Tech, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Do you remember when he was allegedly going to be making 2 visits to Ohio State this fall?
Yeah, I think the reality is sometimes a lot of these kids are learning that if they just say whatever people want to hear, then they get graphics made about their name and comments that they make. And it's just become a very difficult thing to know what's real and what's not. But it also is a result of the fact that these kids still have to travel. They still have to find ways to get to Ohio. It's not easy to get from Nowhereville, Alabama to Ohio if you don't have a ride. And Ohio State is still not in the habit of paying for other people to make unofficial visits. So since Autry took an official visit in the summer, that's where they're at. I don't think it's going to happen with him. Is there anybody else in the class of 2025 that you are thinking about?
Honestly, not really. There's one I'm going to ask you about when we get to the end here, but we'll save that one for the end. It's not a new name or anything. I'm just hoping that there's like some 6'7", 290-pound offensive lineman we've never heard of that magically appears here in the next couple of weeks. But something tells me that's probably not going to happen. Maybe they just pivot to 2026 and they can land 2 or 3 of these Ohio guys quickly. That might make me feel somewhat better, but
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter what happens, and there's still Micah DeBose is still on that list when it comes to the class of 2025. Again, we'll see if he visits next week. If he does, I think that's a really telling. But it's been so eerily quiet there that it's hard to really know what to make of the rumors and the conversation. I know that there's conversation between DeBose and Ohio State commits, but I don't know how much that matters in this world. We'll see. But Ohio State is absolutely going to need, regardless of what happens with Ajitahoon or Micah DeBose, uh, they're going to need at least one starting offensive tackle out of the transfer portal and probably two, depending on what happens with Josh Simmons in the NFL. So they are aware of it. And trust me when I tell you they are preparing for it. It won't matter if they add another tackle in this class or not. If they only sign 3 offensive linemen from high school, they're still going to need two tackles in the transfer portal. If they sign 4, they're still going to need 2 transfer portal tackles. So there's no point in ultimately getting too bogged down in that. Obviously, it's not ideal, but it is what it is, and I don't know how to defend it or attack it. Like it is what it is.
yeah, one last thing on that. Like months ago, or not months ago, weeks ago, we talked about adding a tackle through the portal, and I just threw out the name Jordan Seaton as maybe Colorado's season goes downhill, maybe Dion leaves. Obviously, their season has not gone downhill, and now, like, kind of in an interesting juxtaposition, he is seemingly one of the leaders trying to flip Javon McFadden, one of his buddies from Ohio State, to Colorado.
Yeah.
So it's just funny how these things work out.
Yeah, and Javon did visit Colorado last weekend. I was told on Saturday about it and was told pretty explicitly that Ohio State has been told there's absolutely nothing to worry about there. I tend to believe it. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if those two play together somewhere next year. But the more, I don't know, man. Like, I'm not going to say it could be Ohio State or Colorado because I don't think that's true. But I don't worry about Javon McFadden ending up at Colorado or anywhere else. But stranger things have happened, and we're in the end game now. Speaking of the end game, we're almost at the end game of the regular season for Ohio State. Indiana on Saturday at noon on Fox. It will be a big noon kickoff. It will be a 40-degree day in Columbus, and there will be recruits in the building, including Jordan Woods, as I mentioned, from Carrollton High School in Georgia, a Cincinnati commitment at corner. He visited for the Nebraska game. This will be his second visit in a month, and I'm not going to be shocked if he ends up in the class of 2025 shortly after this weekend's trip. I don't know that I'm going to put him on commit watch or anything like that because I don't think it's fair, and I don't like to set expectations that I'm not entirely sure of, but I do think that things are moving in the right direction for him to be the third corner in the class for Ohio State, 6'3", 185 pounds, big, long, rangy corner. And yeah, he's a 3-star, but he's a player that Ohio State has been evaluating for months. And when they offered him after the Nebraska visit, it became pretty clear that it seemed like they were going to go all in there. Your thoughts on Jordan Woods?
You just kind of unintentionally made me think of my favorite show of all time, The Wire. You almost hit like 2 quotes from The Wire, and I don't even know if you've ever seen that, but there's a quote where Stringer Bell says, just another 40-degree day, and you mentioned it being a 40-degree day on Saturday. And then there's a quote where Avon Barksdale talks about how he wants his corners back. And Ohio State needs 3 corners. We mentioned it just the other week when we talked about this. I like bigger corners. I don't care if he's committed to Cincinnati or Akron or Tulane or whatever. I like that he's a bigger corner. That's the kind of guy I want to throw a dart at. It seems like he's making this visit for a reason. I thought I saw some other schools that were trying to get involved there. Did we talk about Miami?
Miami's been in the conversation, but I don't know if that's going to happen. And I said Carrollton, he's at Cartersville, just to be clear. in Georgia, not Carrollton. Carrollton's where Julian Lewis, the quarterback who decommitted from USC and will likely end up committing to Colorado in the near future, plays. So um, Jordan Woods is likely to be the only official visitor. One of the other cornerbacks that I'm not going to talk about, there's at least a possibility that we see a second corner added to the official visit list this weekend. Um, I'm not going to go any further than that with it just because it's not fair to the kid. But if that ends up getting confirmed for this weekend, then we will talk about it via subtext, which you can sign up below 614-662-4509 and use a free 2-week trial. And I'll talk about it there if that visit comes to fruition. As we look at the rest of the official or visitors, not official, but unofficial visitors for the weekend, Andrew, it seems like an interesting weekend at safety and at corner for Ohio State safety and quarterback. Boy, my brain is fried right now. As of Tuesday night, as we record this, the expectation is that the Buckeyes will host Nathan Bernard, the 2026 quarterback from Ashland, Ohio, that they will host quarterback Gavin Sidwar from LaSalle College in Glenside, PA. He's a newly minted 4-star quarterback prospect on 3 or 247. I'm not sure which one of those. Ohio State saw him throw in the spring. They told him they were going to evaluate him as a junior. They have, and now here we are with him being asked to visit this weekend. And there's still discussion about Jared Curtis, the country's #1 ranked quarterback in the class of 2026, visiting this weekend. That was something that seemed like a pretty sure thing 2 or 3 weeks ago when Ohio State thought that this Indiana game might be a 3:30 start. Now that it's a noon start, I was told last week that there was at least a possibility Curtis was not going to be able to make it because of the noon kickoff time. And as of Tuesday afternoon, I was told that they're still trying to work through the logistics, and it has not been canceled and or confirmed either way. So we'll keep an eye on that. At safety, we're going to see Blaine Bradford, a highly ranked 4-star from Baton Rouge at Ohio State. We're going to see Bishop Gorman athlete Jet Washington, who's a nephew of Kobe Bryant. He was offered by Ohio State a couple weeks ago. Zayden McDonald from New Jersey and Glenside, PA, LaSalle College, teammate of the quarterback we just talked about. But this is a kid named Joey O'Brien, 6'4", 180 pounds, athlete, safety, wide receiver. So those are the two positions that I think are the biggest contingents. But there are some other big players. Is there anybody on the list that you saw that you think you want to talk about?
Well, I mean, I think I'm just waiting to see if Jared Curtis shows up or not. It seems like one of those rare instances where a kid decommits from a school, in this case being Georgia, yet still seems somewhat likely to end up back at that school. I know he was just there again. I don't know. Like at one point, Ohio State led. It seemed like maybe USC for a while. I'm just interested to see if he makes it back. Other than that, like Nathan Bernard, what do you? I can't remember his offer list. Like Penn State's a big one that he has, correct?
Yeah. It's funny. Somebody asked me on Twitter on Monday when it was announced that Nathan was going to visit if his game was similar to Will Howard. And I know the size certainly is. He's a legitimate 6'5.5", almost 6'6", 230 pounds, 240 pounds. I think it's actually a pretty fair comparison to what Will Howard is and how his game may develop. But then I think to myself, Ohio State would not have come close to offering Will Howard out of high school. And it's like they needed to see him for 3 years in college and watch him develop before they made the move on him. Now, maybe you have a luxury in the class of 2026 because you think you're going to have the ability to develop someone over a couple of years. And maybe that opens the door for Bernard. But I think with Matt Panatowski in Ohio, I think with, Jared Curtis, there's a lot. They're going to completely scour the quarterback board. And I think that as long as Nathan Bernard is willing to stay patient and not force himself into a position where he commits to an Indiana or somewhere else early, I think that there's still a chance that maybe by next spring or summer, the Buckeyes could decide that he's the right fit for the position. But I definitely am not sitting here thinking that like he's a guy that's a legitimate offer opportunity right now.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we talked about the quarterback situation ad nauseum. They've got their guy for 25. They've got a guy at least tentatively circled for 27, and who the hell knows what's going to happen for 26? I don't know much about that Sidwar kid you mentioned. I know he's highly ranked too, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe they offer Bernhard. I don't know. I've never watched his tape to be completely honest, so I can't comment much on there. That Jacob Witherspoon kid though is kind of one that I'm interested about as far as maybe I don't want to say maybe somebody that could pop this weekend. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean Jacob's been to Ohio State twice already this season. He's at Avon High School in Ohio, 4-star 2026 defensive back. He told me just like 20 minutes ago that he's not entirely sure if he's visiting this weekend, but he'll definitely be in town for the Michigan game. I've seen it rumored the other way around that he's definitely going to be in town this weekend and may return for the Michigan game, but I can only go by what he literally told me at 15 minutes ago that he's not sure if he's going to be there this weekend, but definitely will be for Michigan. So that's another one to keep an eye on. He tells me that he's planning on waiting until the spring to make a decision, but anything can happen when you're dealing with high school recruiting these days, I suppose. Let's see who else. Micah Smith, who is a teammate or a former teammate of TJ Alford in Vero Beach, Florida. He's going to visit big offensive lineman that Ohio State is very high on and is very high on Ohio State. If there's like one guy that you look at and you think there's an out-of-state offensive lineman that could end up in the 2026 class, I think Micah Champ Smith is the guy to really look at there. He'll be in town. Big visit there. And then Rolesville, North Carolina edge Xavier Haynes Griffin, who is committed to North Carolina. Xavier Griffin Haynes, sorry, committed to North Carolina. He's a kid that visited Ohio State in the summer, and all of the speculation about his recruitment in early September, late August was that he was going to end up committing to Ohio State when he visited for, at that time, was expected to be the Michigan game. He pulled the trigger and committed to North Carolina after a late September visit, and immediately said he still wanted to visit other places. So he's going to be in town this weekend. I see him as a player very similar to Zahir Mathis. Not the same class, obviously, so it's not a like-for-like replacement, but we'll see if he can put himself back on the radar. Ohio State is oddly, like, here we are, it's November 19th, and they're not like in a real hurry to lock up anyone in the class of 2026 because they just, as we talked about at the start of the show, top of the show here, like there's so many things that are going to happen in the last month of the recruiting cycle that it's almost not worth getting so worked up about any out-of-state player before then. And right now, with 2 commitments in the class of 2026, Ohio State has 2 receivers committed. It's Chris Henry Jr. It's now the Buckeyes added Jaden Ricketts on Saturday in the class of 2026, which we have not talked about yet on Talking Stuff. But that's one we thought was going to happen like 2.5 months ago and finally popped. But if a kid is not an in-state prospect, like the odds of them staying committed for a year or longer at this point seem exceedingly low.
Yeah, it really does. But with Ricketts, I guess with him, the first thing I mean, if you're going to bet on something as a receiver, I'm fine with betting on speed, and that seems to be the name of his game based on the film that I saw. So I'm totally fine with taking that kid right now.
Yeah.
One thing with that Griffin Haynes kid, you mentioned him being kind of like a Zahir Mathis type body type. I think it's important to remember that he's like 220 now, a year younger than Mathis. So just kind of keep that in mind if anybody's freaking out about the size or whatever with that one. So
yeah, exactly. He if he ends up at a 235 coming out of high school, then it's a totally different conversation. Last thing before we get to the 4-minute offense, something I haven't really seen talked about. Mike DeWine, Ohio's governor, signed an executive order on Monday, executive order 2024-08D, which essentially allows colleges to pay players directly in the NIL game, which has not been the case in Ohio. That it's a rule, it's a executive order that almost mirrors exactly what Georgia did to make sure that the Bulldogs and Yellow Jackets and those schools could pay directly to players. It doesn't mean a whole lot. It just gives Ohio State a lot of flexibility heading into signing day and the signing period and when it comes to player retention, because they can now pay directly, which is very important. So there's been some legislation in the House in Ohio to get that done, but this sort of speeds that up and circumvents it in the meantime. It's sort of a nerd conversation, but it is important for Ohio State to have that ability so that you're not waiting for big businesses or private donations to come in. And if they have the money in there, I don't even know what fund they have to have it in, to be honest, but if they have it, the school can pay directly. And that should eliminate some of the conversations about, okay, where can we scrounge up this money from? So kind of important heading into signing day.
Yeah, anything that makes it easier on the NIL front. I don't understand all the NIL stuff and all the rules and regulations.
No one does.
I know nobody does, but if it makes it a little easier on Ohio State and landing talented teenage football players, then hey, let's keep doing that.
4-minute offense. What's on your mind? Let's wrap this up.
Okay, yeah, we can go quick. So you mentioned Woods visiting this weekend, cornerback, Cincinnati commit. Another name that might be visiting, maybe not. We'll cross that bridge if we need to, but that's one for sure, and possibly two more names to know at corner. The masses are going to be asking the typical question we talk about every week, name offered. As of now, are you of the belief that he will be visiting for the Michigan game? Yes,
but we've been of the belief that he was visiting 2 other times this season as well, and they fell through 2 or 3 days beforehand. The expectation is that he's going to. If he doesn't, I think so. As I said, the other name that we're not talking about, what you're dealing with is what I would call a real backup plan. Like there's so much uncertainty around Naeem that you cannot be sitting here without another offer out. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. If Naeem does visit, and I've seen back and forth, read different places and heard different people say, well, this week it seems like he's staying. This week it seems like he's not. What's clear after an official visit to Florida, after trips to Auburn multiple times, after trips to Oregon, is that we are in a very uncertain time. And if he doesn't visit, I think that's as good as saying, I'm not coming. I don't know that if he does visit, it means he is, but I think it certainly changes your odds considerably if he does return to Columbus next weekend.
You have been saying that you think Oregon is a bigger threat than Auburn for some time now. I've seen a few national guys kind of come around to that thought. I don't know if he's going to sign with Ohio State or not. I assume nobody does. But if Ohio State loses Dorian Brew and Naeem Offord to Oregon,
and Trey McNutt,
I mean, that'll be a tough look. Even when you have the best corner in the country committed and locked up to sign with Ohio State, that'll be a tough couple of pills to swallow.
Yeah. I don't like the word loss, even as I bring up Trey McNutt, because Ohio State, I don't think really considered that one. Like they had the safety that they really wanted in Fahim Delane. And so like there obviously there's room for multiple good players, but Oregon is going to be a pain in the butt for quite some time. So you better get used to that because they are super aggressive in the way they handle things. They are extremely rich and they are willing to go out and get what they want.
Yeah.
So well,
yeah,
they're going to be around for a while. So that's a rivalry that's going to be real.
Yeah, definitely. Last thing, I know the last few weeks you guys have talked ad nauseum about noon games and how the Indiana game is going to be at noon and Ohio State's not going to be in the spotlight like some of these SEC games. So I don't want to like dwell on it too much, but just from a pure recruiting side, I guess, do you think somebody like Mark Pantoni just absolutely hates noon games on Saturdays for Ohio State, or what do you think about that?
I mean, I tried to ask Ryan Day on Tuesday, like how he felt it was impacting them from a recruiting side of things. And those guys are never going to complain publicly about what is happening. And in some ways, this is the weird catch-22 because I know the coaches, and I know even for us who cover the game, like The noon games mean we're all get home at a reasonable hour. We have more time with our families, and if Ohio State's playing a big game at Ohio Stadium like they are this weekend, like they are next weekend, that place can still get loud as hell, and it can still be an extremely difficult environment for teams to play against. I, there's no doubt it's impacting Ohio State's ability to get top recruits on campus. Like there's no doubt that it is affecting that. So, Ross Bjork, I think he was talking to Dan Hope of 11 Warriors on Monday, said, there's not much they can do. So the change has to come from the fan base and making sure that when Ohio State is at home playing at noon, that the environment is just as good as if it was at night, is just as good as if it was at 3:30. Now, you're not always going to be able to have every player you want on campus, and that's something Ohio State's going to have to continue to deal with until this TV deal runs out, I think, because even publicly complaining about, hey, we're on at noon too often isn't going to matter. The Fox is still going to get the first pick. They're still generally going to pick Ohio State when the Buckeyes play anybody with a pulse, and sometimes even when they play someone without one. So this is what's going to happen. It just increases the importance of the non-game day visits for Ohio State, something the Buckeyes have done very, very well over the last 4 or 5 years. They've crushed the summertime visits. They make those things matter. So if you're a fan and you're frustrated about it, this Saturday is a prime example where you can make an impact. I saw Riley Pettijohn's father tweeting earlier on Tuesday, talking to, I don't know, somebody in the media who had quoted Ryan Day and what he was talking about at his press conference about how they need the place to be rocking this weekend. And he said, recruits, if you want to help Ohio State recruit, that's how you do it. You show up on Saturday in the top 5 matchup and you scream your freaking head off for 3.5 hours, and you make that place impossible for Indiana to play against. And that's what Ohio State's going to need to do. And yeah, that they're going to miss out on some players visiting, but one game day visit is not going to cost them a recruit long term. What's going to cost them long term is fan support that is not happy.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
take what you get. It sucks, and I totally understand it. I know people want to spend the whole day doing the football thing. No one tells you have to leave right after the game. You can go out in the parking lot and tailgate and watch football after the game. And so don't be afraid to do that. You can still celebrate. It can still be an all day long party, but it just it's going to be noon. It's going to be 40 degrees. Come out and be ready to rock and roll. So that's
Yeah.
how it goes.
We can end things there, but I'm glad you mentioned Riley Pettijohn, because how nice is it that they got that kid committed and have him and his family locked in? That's a pretty big deal.
Pretty important. Yeah, we try to cover a lot of ground here on this episode of Talking Stuff. Hopefully we got to everything that's on people's minds. Probably didn't, because everyone's all over the place, just like I am. And we're going to try to knock it all out. We will, of course, have a show next week for leading up to the Michigan game. And then the week after that, as we head into the signing day period. So there will not be any breaks. We've taken this on a bi-weekly basis when Ohio State's been on the road. They won't be on the road for a while. And then 2 weeks from now is the signing period, the week of the Big Ten championship game, provided Ohio State's there. So it's going to be interesting. He's Andrew Ellis. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. This has been Talking Stuff on the podcast. We really do appreciate you watching, appreciate you listening. Please, if you are here and you have not subscribed to the channel, please do that. Like the video. That helps us with the algorithms. And tell your friends, if they're Ohio State Buckeyes football fans, that they should be watching and listening to the podcast. Thanks again. See you later.